What if the real architects of power weren't just kings and conquerors, but queens and advisors with quiet influence and sharp ethics? In this deep dive, we uncover the half-smile of resistance, wisdom, and strategy through the women of the Chachnama. Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take a stack of sources, zero in on the most fascinating bits, and, well, unpack them for you. Today, we're taking a really deep plunge into a specific historical text. It's a 13th century Persian work called the Chachnama.
Yeah, and for a long time, the Chachnama has been read in a pretty specific way. It's traditionally seen as the story of this Brahmin ruler Chach, and maybe more significantly for many people, the conquest of his kingdom, Sind, by the Muslim general Muhammad bin Qasim. That was back in 711 CE.
Right.
So standard accounts often frame this as a, well, pretty straightforward narrative, foreign Muslim conquest over native Hindus.
And that framing, it's had a huge impact, hasn't it? It often sets this pretty contentious stage for understanding parts of South Asian politics, even right up to today. But the source material we're diving into today, these are excerpts from a book of conquest by Manan Ahmed Asif. It proposes a radically different way to read this text.
Exactly. Asif argues the Chachnama isn't just some simple chronicle of conquest, and maybe not even just a translation of an earlier Arabic work, which is what some people thought.
Okay.
He sees it as an originally Persian text, a really sophisticated piece of political theory, actually, and it's embedded deeply in both Indic and Islamic ethical traditions.
Right.
And here's the kicker, the crucial part. It presents a fundamentally different view of power precisely because it highlights the central role, often completely overlooked, that women play in the narrative.
Okay, so our mission today in this deep dive is to really get into what happens when we read the Chachnama through this lens. Not just conquest, but political theory. How does that reveal women as, well, the chief drivers of the story, as figures who are actually enacting ethics and guiding rulers in ways that traditional readings just miss entirely?
Let's maybe start by grounding ourselves a bit. Think about the physical world the Chachnama came out of. A place like Uch, for instance, an ancient city in Sind.
Right.
The landscape there, it's just layered with history. It's dotted with these shrines, and many of them are actually dedicated to prominent women, figures like, say, Bibi Jawindi.
Yeah, I've heard of her shrine. It's remembered as a place tied to Sufi ethics, spiritual claims for the city. Isn't Bibi Jawindi's shrine a UNESCO site?
It is, exactly. So you have this physical, enduring evidence right there, this memory literally built into the landscape.
And
yet, when you look at a lot of the traditional scholarly accounts of Sufi Islam in India, what do you find? Or rather, what don't you find?
the women saints.
Pretty much. There's often this striking absence. The narrative becomes predominantly masculine, despite the material proof, despite local memory.
It immediately makes you wonder, doesn't it? What kind of histories have we not been writing? What happens if, like our source asks, we actually start seeing women as integral, as essential actors in these powerful medieval states in northern India, instead of just, figures on the sidelines?
Yeah.
Or footnotes.
Because, like we said, within that standard conquest framework, the Chachnama narrative just shrinks right down.
Yeah.
It becomes mostly about just two men, Chach and Qasim. It's just a story of who took over whose territory. Men fighting men.
Right. But this reframing, it completely shifts the focus, doesn't it? What if the core story isn't really about the men conquering space, but about political power itself? And maybe that story has to include women to even make sense.
That's precisely the argument. Our source contends the Chachnama doesn't just, mention women in passing. It actively enacts its ethics, its political theory through them, through their speech, their gaze, their actions.
Okay, so how does that work? How does it show that?
Yeah. Well, think of it like this. Their actions often push the story forward. Their gaze, the text, often describes what they see. It makes the narrative pause. It invites us, the reader or listener, to look closer, to see things from their perspective. And their monologues, when they get a chance to speak at length, that's often where the text really lays out its core principles about just rule, about ethics. The source sees them fundamentally as ethical subjects, par excellence even.
Okay, let's really try to unpack this. Let's look at some specific moments the source highlights, starting right here at the beginning of the text, maybe.
Good idea. The first really powerful woman we encounter after Chach himself appears is Sohnan Devi. She's the queen of Raisahasi, the king Chach serves.
And Chach is introduced how? As a scribe.
Yeah, a Brahmin scribe, comes from an ascetic background, gets a job in the king's court, and the text really signals the importance of the next scene. It slows right down when Sohnan Devi first sees him. The whole narrative focuses on her perspective. describes her gaze and how she finds him just, well, incredibly appealing. Beautiful, well-proportioned, with rosy red cheeks, the text says.
And she doesn't just, like, admire him quietly?
Not at all. She's immediately captivated, sends him this really intense message, basically saying his eyelashes have wounded her heart and he needs to cure her ills or she'll, dramatically kill herself.
Wow, okay. That's direct.
Intense is right. But here's where the text introduces a really crucial ethical layer, according to our source. Chach refuses her.
Right.
But his refusal is framed very ethically. He cites his Brahmin background, his ascetic family, his duty to the king. He says it would be foolhardy. And significantly, he admits his own potential for sin. He says, I cannot take more sins upon myself.
So he doesn't shame her.
Exactly. That's key. He doesn't call her immoral for her desire. He turns the ethical spotlight onto his own conduct, his own responsibilities.
That's a fascinating twist. And what's her response? Is she angry?
Even more surprising. The text says she replies with great love and care. She accepts his decision. She just asks if she can see him sometimes, so that I can live with the hoe of your company.
Huh. That's not the usual trope, is it?
Not at all. And this interaction is crucial. It establishes their connection not just on the level of, say, raw desire, but on a level that can actually exist and develop within ethical boundaries.
Okay.
This initial restraint, this great love and care she shows, it really sets the stage for her later actions, which are profoundly political. The source argues Sohnan Devi is then presented as the real architect of Chach's rise to power, especially after King Sahasi dies without an heir.
So she's the one with the plan.
Absolutely. She has the foresight, the strategic mind. She immediately tells Chach the king is dead, but says keep it secret for 6 months.
Why 6 months?
Her plan is, during that time, to basically encourage other claimants to the throne to fight amongst themselves. Let them eliminate each other, while she and Chach quietly build support inside the court.
Wow, that's pretty calculated. Masterful, even.
It is. And then, when the king's brother, Raimari, shows up unexpectedly to claim the throne, Chach gets scared. He hesitates.
And Sohnan Devi.
She doesn't just offer gentle advice. No, she confronts him directly, challenges his courage. She says something really powerful like, look, I'm a veiled woman. If you need me to fight for you, give me your clothes. I'll go out and fight while you sit inside here wearing my clothes.
Whoa.
Yeah. She basically demands, go out like a lion and defend your claim.
She's essentially shaming him into action, challenging gender roles to push him. What happens then?
Well, Chach does go out. He fights Raimarit, kills him in battle, and then Sohnan Devi makes her next move.
Which is?
She goes public, announces there's no biological heir, and declares that Chach, having now proven both his intellect through her plan, remember, and his valor in battle, is the rightful custodian, the rightful ruler of the polity.
And how does she seal that?
Immediately proposes marriage to him, right there in front of the court. And they approve. It legitimizes his claim instantly.
So the source's reading here sees her as much more than just like a kingmaker figure.
Far more. She is the embodiment of this astute, ethical, political subject. Her decisions, her pronouncements, her strategy, they aren't just plot points. They convey a whole theory of how power works.
Like what?
Like that a capable, moral person can rule even without a blood claim. That political will requires skillfully managing public opinion, elite opinion. It needs bravery, maybe even some ruthlessness, but also commitment.
So in this part of the story,
the source suggests that, effectively, she's the ruler. She's guiding Chach, teaching him while he learns the ropes.
okay, let's move further into the narrative then. The source highlights another key woman, right? Queen Ladi.
Yes, Queen Ladi. We're now in the middle of the Chachnama. Ladi is the wife of Raja Dahar, who is Chach's son. This is after Qasim has killed Dahar in battle and is now besieging the city of Aror. Ladi gets captured.
And Qasim sends her to the city walls to get them to surrender.
Exactly. Tells her to tell the people inside that Dahar is dead. But they don't believe her. They accuse her of lying, of siding with the enemy. They call Qasim's forces cow-eating thieves.
Harsh. How does she react?
The text specifically notes her restraint. She doesn't lash out despite the insults. But this scene also introduces another powerful woman.
Oh, who's that?
A priestess. When the people don't believe Queen Ladi, they go consult this priestess to find out if Dahar is really dead.
And she has a way to find out.
Apparently, she performs some kind of ritual. She brings back proof using, the text says, still green shoots from the plants of Sohnan. She claims she couldn't have gotten these if Dahar were still alive.
Huh. Interesting detail.
And her assertion is powerful. She says something like, if he was alive, he wouldn't be able to hide from me. It shows her own kind of sacral authority tied to this specific place, Sohnan, translating directly into political influence. The people believe her word and they surrender.
Okay, so Qasim takes the city. What's his first move?
Well, his initial instinct is pretty harsh. Punishment for resistance. He makes a hasty decision to kill everyone who fought against him.
But Queen Ladi steps in. They captured Queen.
Yes, and this is absolutely pivotal. She advises Qasim, she tells him, look, killing the inhabitants, the builders, the traders, the ordinary folk, that's like killing your own wealth.
Because they're the foundation.
Exactly. They are the city. They're the basis of his future rule. Killing them is counterproductive.
And Qasim listens.
Immediately. The text is really clear on this. It says he listens right away and even quotes him saying, this is the order of Queen Ladi. Then he grants peace to the city. He explicitly credits her counsel for the just action.
Wow. And then, similar to Chach and Sohnan Devi,
Qasim marries Ladi. And again, the source sees this as more than just personal. It's a political act mirroring the earlier one. It cements the new regime's connection to the existing political landscape, building on established structures, gaining legitimacy through alliance with the previous queen. And guided by Ladi's advice, Qasim then goes on to establish a, well, remarkably diverse and seemingly quite fair polity.
how so?
He sets up a poll tax based on status, which was common, but supposedly fairly. He declares religious freedom. He appoints people to administrative jobs, whether they convert or not. He even sets up a relief fund for people hurt by the war. And crucially, he appoints Dahar's own nobles and Brahmins as his advisors.
So Queen Ladi's role here is really significant then. Parallel to Sohnan Devi in a way.
Very much so, according to this reading. She speaks for the people, in a sense. She manages that difficult transition of power. She basically provides Qasim with the essential techniques, the how-to of just rule needed to found a stable state with diverse populations. Her guidance is presented as absolutely fundamental to Qasim's success.
All right, so we've seen Sohnan Devi establish Chach and Ladi guide Qasim. What about the end of the story? The source talks about Dahar's daughters, right? And the end of Qasim.
Yes. This takes us to the very end of the Chachnama narrative, and it involves Dahar's two daughters, Suryadeo and Permaldeo, and it's quite dramatic. It leads directly to the demise of Muhammad bin Qasim himself.
Now, Qasim, up to this point, he's been presented pretty positively, hasn't he? Almost like an ideal ruler.
He has. The text describes him as, honest, devoted, empathetic, just, compassionate, kind, brave. He seems to embody a lot of the qualities of ideal subjecthood and governance that we saw being developed around Chach earlier.
But there's a but.
There's a big but. And this is the critical distinction the source highlights. Qasim has what turns out to be a fatal flaw.
Which is?
His absolute, unquestioning fealty to his superiors, especially the corruptible ones like Hajjaj, his patron, and crucially the Caliph back in Baghdad.
Unlike Chach.
Exactly. Chach, in the end, seems guided more by his own internal ethical compass, often shaped by Sohnan Devi's counsel initially. Qasim, on the other hand, repeatedly surrenders his own judgment, his own sense of right, to obey external orders even when they seem flawed or unjust. And this sets up the final tragic act.
So what happens? Dahar's daughters are sent to Baghdad.
Yes, as spoils of war sent to the Caliph's harem. And the Caliph here is painted in sharp contrast to Qasim. He's shown as licentious, driven purely by desire, not justice or wisdom. He calls for the eldest daughter, Suryadeo.
And this is where the resistance starts.
Right here. When the Caliph reaches for her hand, Suryadeo pulls back. And she tells him this strategic lie.
What does she say?
She claims that Qasim actually kept them for 3 nights before sending them on to the Caliph. She sort of implies, is this the king's strange custom? And she says that after suffering such indignities, they are not worthy of the Caliph's attention.
Oof. The Caliph believes her.
Instantly. The text emphasizes he's blinded by his desire and shock at this perceived insult to his authority. He doesn't investigate, doesn't pause. He acts purely on impulse.
And orders Qasim.
He sends a swift, brutal order. Qasim is to literally sew himself inside uncured, leather-raw sheepskin, basically, and be sent back to the capital immediately.
That's bizarre. And fatal. Does Qasim obey?
He does. He's in Udaipur when he gets the order. And this moment perfectly demonstrates his defining characteristic, that fatal flaw. His unquestioning obedience to a corrupt authority. He follows the command, has himself wrapped up, put in a box, and dies on the journey to Baghdad. Suffocation, exposure, something grim.
So the box arrives in Baghdad.
Yes. And the Caliph, still unaware he's been tricked, calls for the daughters. He wants them to witness Qasim's body. He's gloating, basically, saying, look, gaze at one who obeys my commands. He did as I ordered and gave up his life, showing off his absolute power.
And what do the daughters do?
This is the moment. The eldest daughter gives that famous half smile. She unveils herself. And then she delivers the longest monologue in the entire Chachnama.
The longest. The text really gives her the stage here.
Absolutely. It signals the profound importance of what she's about to say.
And what does she say? It must be powerful.
It's devastating. A masterpiece of political and ethical critique. She starts by laying out her own theory of good governance. A wise ruler, she says, must weigh what they hear on the scale of intellect, consult their heart's intuition, be free from doubt, and always act justly.
She's directly schooling the caliph.
Totally. She condemns him right to his face, tells him he has power, sure, but zero understanding, that he's corrupted by desire. She points out if he hadn't been so clouded by his own impulses, he would have investigated her claim. It's a direct accusation of his incompetence as a ruler.
And then she reveals the truth.
Then she reveals the lie. She tells him Qasim was honorable, treated them with respect, like a brother or son, kept their purity intact. They lied, she states plainly, to avenge their father, who Qasim killed, and to avenge being made slaves. For them, she implies this act of revenge was an ethical duty.
Wow. Does she say anything about Qasim himself?
Yes, she doesn't spare him either. She condemns him for his foolish obedience, says he should have used his intellect, questioned the order, maybe delayed it. That could have saved his life. His blind loyalty was his downfall.
And the final point.
She ends with this incredibly sharp critique of the caliph's actions, not just on ethical grounds, but on purely pragmatic ones, killing such a great commander, someone who expanded the empire so much, all for the sake of 2 slave girls, based on an unverified claim. It was profoundly unwise, even from a selfish perspective of maintaining power. She basically says, even if he had misbehaved, even then a smart ruler wouldn't have just killed him like that.
How does the caliph react to all this?
The text says he's left completely speechless. Awash in sorrow, literally biting his hand in regret and shame at his own impulsiveness and stupidity.
And the daughters. What happens to them?
He orders them immured, walled up alive, as punishment for their deception.
So how does the source interpret this whole final episode?
It reads this ending as the ethical core, the real coda of the entire Chachnama. It's this powerful, scathing critique of corrupt, impulsive, desire-driven rule at the center in Baghdad, sharply contrasted with Qasim's own fatal flaw, his blind obedience.
And it validates the daughter's actions.
It highlights the ethics of resistance from their perspective. The text gives them this huge platform to explain their motives, framing it as fulfilling a duty of vengeance for their father and their people. And notably, the text itself doesn't seem to denigrate their act, even though it leads to tragedy.
It's really striking how the text uses these women, Sohnan, Devi, Ladi, the daughters, to articulate such complex ideas about power, justice, ethics, resistance.
It really is. But, our source is careful to point out it's not only women who function as these ethical subjects in the Chachnama. While they are perhaps the most prominent and drive key turning points,
There are others too.
yes, the text includes other figures you see, prophets, seers, various ministers, advisors who also embody or articulate ethical principles and political theory.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A good one is Raja Dahar's son, Jazina. His birth story itself is presented as archetypal, involving his father Dahar fighting a lion, which is meant to signify Jazina's own future bravery and piety.
And his name. Didn't you mention something about his name?
Right. The text actually gives his name in 3 different languages, Arabic, Persian, and his original Sindhi name, Jaisinha. And they all mean something like victorious lion. The source suggests this detail is meant to emphasize his multifaceted persona, someone who fits within the text's diverse cultural world.
And how does he show ethics?
Well, there's a scene where he meets the women of the Raja of Kiraj, and he consciously averts his gaze, seeing them respectfully, the text says, like mothers and sisters.
Okay.
And this contrasts, interestingly, with the Raja's sister, who, in that same scene, is described as being smitten by Jaisina's beauty. So again, you see the text using a woman's gaze to highlight a character's significant quality.
And his ethics aren't just like one specific religious type.
Exactly. The source argues Jaisina's ethics seem to go beyond just, say, Brahmin asceticism. They incorporate values that would resonate with Muslims too. It shows that in the world of the Chachnama, virtue and just conduct aren't strictly tied to one religious identity. He's another character who embodies ethical political theory once you look beyond just Chach and Qasim.
Okay, so the Chachnama presents this world with complex ethical actors, including very powerful women. How does this fit or not fit with other things happening around the 13th century when it was written?
That's a great question. And what's fascinating is that this depiction of women as significant political and ethical agents in the Chachma isn't entirely unique for its time, although the Chachma's emphasis might be distinct. Our source connects it to some other contemporary accounts, like Jujani's Tabakari Nasiri. Jujani was writing around the same time. He was an eyewitness to many events, and he gives this account of Razia Sultana.
The woman who ruled the Delhi Sultanate.
Exactly, daughter of Iltutmish.
Hmm.
And Jujani's description is remarkable. He calls her a great king. He says she had intelligence and wisdom, that she enacted justice, possessed every quality that a king possessed. High praise.
And didn't her father choose her over his sons?
He did. Iltutmish explicitly thought she was more fit to rule. And Jujani notes that this prediction proved true. What's striking is that for both Iltutmish and Jujani, writing back in the 13th century, there seems to have been, as the source puts it, no moral or ethical barrier to Razia's kingship. It was seen as possible, even natural for a woman of her caliber.
And Jujani mentions other women too.
Yes, he documents other elite women in his time who were actively involved in politics, managing successions, acting as governors, serving as important advisors. It suggests there really was a 13th century courtly culture where women could be and were seen as full political agents.
So how does the Chachnama compare then? Is it just reflecting that reality?
It reflects some of that, perhaps, but the key difference our source points out is emphasis. While Jujani documents women as capable political actors, the Chachnama in this reading goes a step further. It positions its key women characters, Sohnan Devi, Ladi, Dahar's daughters, as custodians of ideal political theory itself. They're not just ruling or advising, they were embodying and articulating the very principles of justice, alliance building, accommodation of diversity, recognition of power dynamics. The Chachnama's world, as depicted, seems to show very little anxiety about women holding political power or about forming complex cross-sectarian alliances. It presents it almost as normal.
Okay, here's the part that maybe feels inevitable and a bit discouraging. This complex, nuanced world we see in the Chachnama, this place where women are central ethical voices, where different cultures interact. Did that understanding last?
Sadly, no. Not really. This sophisticated, what our source calls this dialogic world of the Chachnama, it was largely lost or obscured in later interpretations of the text and, more broadly, in how women's roles in power were remembered.
How did that happen? When did it start to change?
Pretty early, actually.
Yeah.
By the mid-14th century, just a century or so later, you start seeing a definite shift in subsequent Persianate historical writing.
Okay.
Take Dahar's daughter, for instance. Despite her incredibly powerful ethical indictment of the caliph in the Chachnama, later writers often start portraying her very differently. She gets reduced to being simply a transgressive and corrupt woman, someone who used deceit and manipulation just to threaten the proper male political order. Her ethical critique gets completely erased.
And you see this pattern elsewhere, too.
Yes. Think about Razia Sultana again. Later accounts, like Ibn Battuta's Travels in the 14th century, when he discusses her reign, they tend to focus much more on her perceived transgressions.
Like dressing as a man.
Exactly. Dressing like a man, her close relationship with an African slave advisor. The focus shifts to things that made her seem unnatural or improper as a female ruler. It effectively erases that naturalness of political power that earlier texts like the Chachnama or Juzjani seemed perfectly comfortable with.
Any other examples of this reinterpretation?
Yeah, another good one is Ain-ul-Mulk Abdullah Maru's Inshai Maru, also from the 14th century. He actually uses the Chachnama story, the part about the daughter's lie.
But not to talk about their critique.
No, he uses it specifically to characterize the entire people of Sind as being inherently treacherous and untrustworthy. He completely omits the daughter's long, crucial monologue, her ethical reasoning. He reduces their complex act of vengeance and critique solely to a simple transgression against central authority. The context vanishes.
And this reduction just continued.
Pretty much. Fast forward to British colonial times, you get accounts like Thomas Hood's 1861 versification of parts of the Chachnama. And here, the women are reduced even further. They become these sort of oriental romantic subjects, figures with conniving half-smiles maybe, but ultimately passive or just manipulative individuals caught up in the whims of despotic rulers, the political depth, the ethical agency. gone.
But haven't there been attempts to sort of reclaim these figures more recently?
Yes, but often in very specific ways. In 20th century Sindhi nationalist discourses, for example, women like Queen Ladi and Dahar's daughters are definitely recuperated, as the source puts it, but they're primarily recast as straightforward resistors,
Yeah.
meaning they become servals, proud personifications of an ancient Sindhi nation standing firm against external imperial aggressors, particularly against the perceived aggressor state of Pakistan. There's a famous poem by Chachnama that explicitly compares their bodies to the Sindhi nation itself. It's powerful, but still simplifies their role compared to the Chachnama's complexity.
And how does the Pakistani narrative handle them? Or Qasim?
Well, conversely, the Pakistani state narrative often tends to sideline the Chachnama's difficult ending for Qasim. Instead, it often centers on a different woman mentioned very briefly in the text, one supposedly rescued by Qasim from pirates.
Ah.
And that moment is used to position Qasim as this heroic founder figure, the first citizen of Pakistan, effectively. It conveniently ignores the Chachnama's own rather stinging denouement for Qasim, delivered, remember, by Dahar's daughters.
So it seems like across the board, later accounts just couldn't handle the complexity.
That's the pattern, yes. Whether they were reduced to figures of sexual transgression or romantic ideals or simple one-dimensional resistance, these later accounts consistently stripped away the Chachnama's original portrayal of these women as embodying sophisticated ethical and political thought. That half smile of the daughter gets mentioned sometimes, but its real meaning as this profound ethical indictment delivered by a shrewd political mind gets completely lost.
And our source connects this kind of textual erasure, this forgetting, to how we
Yeah.
look at physical history, too, like the shrines in Uj.
Exactly. Just like Bibi Jawindi's tomb in Oleg stands as this material evidence of women's historical power, even if they're absent from many scholarly books, the story around another famous tomb, the tomb of Anarkali in Lahore, serves as a really interesting parallel.
Anarkali, that's a very famous story, isn't it? The tragic love story.
Super famous. The popular version goes. Anarkali was a beautiful slave girl in Emperor Akbar's court. She falls in love with his son, Prince Salim, who later becomes Emperor Jahangir. Akbar supposedly catches them exchanging a smile, sees it as a massive transgression, and orders her to be buried alive in a wall.
Room.
Very. And the story continues that Salim, heartbroken, later builds this magnificent tomb for her, which is actually the oldest Mughal building still standing in Lahore. There's even an inscription attributed to Jahangir expressing his undying love and grief.
Okay, so what's the connection to the Chachnama daughters?
Look at the core elements. Again, the focus is on a perceived transgression involving women, and often it centers on a smile, this ambiguous, potentially loaded gesture. That becomes the main event.
And it distracts from something else.
Potentially. This romanticized focus on the tragic woman and her transgressive smile displaces what could have been a very real, very serious political conflict simmering beneath the surface, maybe a power struggle between the reigning Emperor Akbar and his ambitious son Salim. The smile becomes this thematic link, perhaps, between these narratives where female agency is either hidden, distorted, or becomes the scapegoat.
But is the Anarkali story even true? I thought historians debated that.
They do. Scholars like Shireen Masadi have pointed out there's actually very little basis for the dramatic Anarkali story in the official Mughal chronicles of the time. Her historical existence as this specific figure is seriously questioned.
Okay, so if she might not have even existed like that, what's the point?
Well, this is where our source asks a different, maybe more interesting question. Instead of getting bogged down in the facticity, did Anarkali definitely exist exactly as the legend says? What if historians shifted focus? What if we looked at the political and social landscape that allowed such a story to emerge, take hold, and endure for centuries? What does the story itself, whether factual or not, tell us about power and gender in that world?
Meaning, look at the context around the story.
Precisely. Because when you do look at that landscape around the supposed time of Anarkali, you see other undeniably real, strong, politically powerful women, figures like Akbar's own mother, Hamida Banu Begum, or Salim's influential wife, Jagat Gosain. These women were significant historical actors in their own right.
But they often get overlooked, too.
They do. They're themselves often absent or marginalized in those traditional historical accounts that focus laser-like on the male emperors, the conquests, the battles. So the material history, like the Anarkali tomb and these enduring popular stories, they hint at the presence of influential women actors. But traditional historiography, with its focus on kings and conquerors, often just omits them or flattens their roles, much like the complex women of the Chachnama were later reduced.
Okay, so pulling all this together then, if we step back, what's the big picture takeaway from reading the Chachnama through this lens?
I think the central takeaway is just how dramatically our understanding can shift. When you read a text like the Chachnama, not simply as a chronicle of conquest, but as a work of political theory, and crucially, when you pay close attention to its women characters, a whole different world opens up.
A world where women are.
Where elite women are presented not just as passive objects or background figures, but as active, central ethical subjects. They are articulating complex ideas about just rule, they're challenging authority, they're critiquing power structures, and they are profoundly driving the narrative forward. They matter to the story's core meaning.
And this richer, more complicated picture got lost.
Tragically, yes. This nuance, this dialogic world that the Chachnama seems to present, a world that, again, shows little inherent anxiety about women holding real political power or about complex cross-cultural and cross-sectarian alliances, that whole picture was systematically obscured. Later readings became fixated on conquest, on religious difference, and they reduced the roles of these truly remarkable women to simplistic tropes. The temptress, the romantic victim, the straightforward resistor. The depth vanished.
So revisiting texts like this, with an eye for gender and power, is more than just an academic game.
Absolutely. It really underscores the argument that going back to historical texts, especially the ones that have been traditionally read through these dominant, often male-centric, conquest-focused frameworks, and doing so with a conscious effort to uncover the overlooked voices, the hidden perspectives, like gendered power and the roles women actually played it, isn't just about adding diversity points. It can fundamentally change our understanding of how political power operated, what ethical ideas were actually being debated, the sheer complexity of past societies. It gives us a much richer, truer picture, I think, than the standard narratives often allow.
Okay, let's leave everyone with something to think about then. Here's a final thought for you to consider. If simply shifting our focus, looking closely at the overlooked female characters and listening to their words in just one historical text like the Chachnama can so radically change how we understand political power, ethics, and history for that specific time and place, what else might we be missing?
Yeah, I mean, how many other half smiles, those moments of quiet resistance, hidden wisdom, complex strategy embodied by figures pushed to the margins, are waiting out there, waiting to reveal hidden layers of complexity in the vast sweep of historical narratives that have for so long really only centered on the kings and the conquerors.
It makes you think, doesn't it, about how these narratives get constructed, what stories are chosen to be told, and maybe more importantly, what perspectives get left out, maybe unintentionally, maybe not, when we only rely on those traditional frameworks. What happens when you really start looking closely at the edges of the frame?
What else is hidden in plain sight?
Something to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Chachnama and its remarkable, often overlooked women.